The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in the sterile waiting room of Meridian Defense Solutions, casting harsh shadows across the beige walls adorned with framed certificates and military memorabilia. Chen sat perfectly still in the uncomfortable plastic chair, her posture upright despite the 3-hour wait. At 34, her slight frame and quiet demeanor often caused people to overlook her presence entirely, something she had learned to use to her advantage over the years. She wore a simple navy blazer over pressed khakis, her black hair pulled back in a neat bun that revealed the small scar along her left temple, a souvenir from her last deployment that she'd grown accustomed to covering with makeup. Today, however, she'd chosen to leave it visible, a subtle reminder of experiences that couldn't be captured on a resume. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The waiting room buzzed with the nervous energy of other applicants, mostly men in their 20s and 30s wearing expensive suits and confident expressions. They exchanged war stories about their previous corporate positions, dropping names of executives and discussing stock options with the casual familiarity of those who had never worried about their next meal or wondered if they'd see another sunrise. Rebecca listened without participating, her trained ear catching fragments of conversation that revealed more about these candidates than they probably intended. The man to her left boasted about his MBA from Wharton while simultaneously checking his phone every 30 seconds. The woman across the room name-dropped her connections at Lockheed Martin while nervously tapping her designer heels against the floor. None of them seemed to notice the small woman in the corner who had arrived precisely 15 minutes early and hadn't moved since taking her seat. They probably assumed she was applying for an administrative position, if they thought about her at all. The interview process. Chen. The voice belonged to a sharply dressed woman in her 40s with perfectly styled blonde hair and the kind of smile that never quite reached her eyes. She stood in the doorway holding a tablet, her gaze sweeping the room with practiced efficiency before landing on Rebecca with barely concealed surprise. "That's me," Rebecca said, rising smoothly from her chair. She moved with the economical grace of someone who had spent years being acutely aware of her surroundings, though to the casual observer she simply appeared to be a quiet professional woman. "I'm Jennifer Morrison, Senior Vice President of Human Resources," the woman said, extending a manicured hand. "I'll be conducting your interview today along with our department head." Rebecca's handshake was firm but brief, another habit ingrained by years of service. She followed Jennifer through a maze of cubicles and glass offices, noting the layout with the automatic assessment of someone who had been trained to quickly understand any environment she entered. The interview room was an impressive space with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of downtown Seattle. A massive conference table dominated the center of the room, around which sat 3 people who would determine Rebecca's professional fate. Jennifer took her seat at the head of the table, flanked by 2 men who couldn't have been more different in appearance. To her left sat Bradley Morrison, no relation to Jennifer, as he was quick to point out, a heavy-set man in his 50s with the soft look of someone who had spent his entire career behind a desk. His expensive suit strained slightly across his midsection, and his handshake was the kind of overly firm grip that men often use to compensate for insecurity. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, like this video, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The second man, introduced as Marcus Webb, head of strategic operations, was younger and leaner, with the kind of artificial confidence that came from reading too many business leadership books. He wore a perfectly tailored suit and a watch that probably cost more than Rebecca's monthly rent, and his smile had the practiced emptiness of someone who had learned to weaponize charm. "So, Miss Chen," Jennifer began, consulting her tablet. "With theatrical precision, I have to say, your resume is interesting. You've been out of the workforce for quite some time." Rebecca had anticipated this question, though the phrasing rankled slightly. "I was serving my country for the past 12 years, she said evenly. "I wouldn't characterize that as being out of the workforce." Bradley chuckled, a sound that seemed to rumble up from his considerable belly. "Well, yes, but that's quite different from the corporate environment, isn't it? We're looking for someone who can hit the ground running in a fast-paced business setting." "I understand," Rebecca replied, though her tone suggested she understood more than they might be comfortable with. "Could you tell me more about the specific challenges this position would address?" Marcus leaned forward, his expression suggesting he was about to share something profound. "We're expanding our government contracts division, and we need someone who can interface with military personnel and understand their unique requirements. Your background certainly fits that bill, but we're concerned about your ability to adapt to our corporate culture." The phrase, corporate culture, hung in the air like a challenge. Rebecca had researched Meridian Defense Solutions extensively. And she knew their culture consisted largely of overcharging the government for services that could be performed more efficiently by actual military personnel. She also knew that pointing this out would not improve her chances of employment. "I'm very adaptable," she said instead. "In my previous position, I frequently had to adjust to new environments and work with diverse teams under challenging circumstances." Jennifer's smile became slightly more genuine, though not necessarily in a good way. "Yes, about that. I notice you've been quite vague about your actual role in the military. You list your rank as major, but there's very little detail about your specific duties or achievements." Rebecca had expected this question as well, though she had hoped to avoid it. Much of her service record was classified, and the parts that weren't classified were often the parts she preferred not to discuss in corporate conference rooms. "I served in various capacities," she said carefully. "Much of my work involved coordinating with local populations in conflict zones, ensuring the safety of personnel, and facilitating communication between different military units." It was the truth, though it was about as complete as describing a symphony by mentioning that it involved musical instruments. Rebecca had actually served as a military intelligence officer specializing in human intelligence operations, spending years in some of the most dangerous locations on Earth, building networks of local contacts and gathering information that had directly contributed to saving American lives. She had coordinated not just with local populations but with warlords, tribal leaders, and government officials in countries where a single mistake could result in the death of everyone under her command. The safety of personnel she had ensured included successfully extracting her team from a compound in Afghanistan while under heavy fire, carrying a wounded soldier to safety despite taking shrapnel in her own leg. The communication between different military units had included serving as a liaison between special forces teams and conventional units, translating not just languages but cultural nuances and tactical requirements that meant the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. But none of this was information she could share in a corporate interview, and she had learned that civilians often became uncomfortable when confronted with the realities of military service. It was easier to speak in euphemisms and let them make their own assumptions. The condescending questions. Bradley consulted his own notes, which appeared to consist largely of printed-out web articles about hiring veterans. "Tell me, how do you handle stress? Military life can be quite rigid, and the corporate world requires a lot more flexibility and creativity." Rebecca took a slow breath, recognizing the implicit assumption that military service somehow made people less capable of independent thought. "I found that my military experience actually enhanced my ability to think creatively under pressure. When you're working with limited resources in unpredictable environments, innovation becomes essential." Marcus nodded sagely, as if he had personal experience with such situations. "That's good to hear. We often find that veterans struggle with the collaborative nature of modern business. How do you feel about working in teams where there isn't a clear hierarchy?" The question revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of how the military actually functioned, but Rebecca maintained her composure. "I've found that effective teamwork depends more on mutual respect and clear communication than on formal hierarchy. Some of my most successful projects involved working with people from different backgrounds and expertise levels." She was thinking of the time she had spent 3 months working with a team of Afghan translators, local tribal leaders, and Navy SEALs to establish a secure supply route through territory controlled by 3 different insurgent groups. The mission had required not just tactical precision but cultural sensitivity and the ability to navigate complex political relationships where a single misunderstanding could have cost lives. The team had no formal hierarchy. She was the ranking American officer, but the tribal leaders answered to their own authority structures, and the SEALs operated under their own command structure. Success had depended entirely on building trust and finding common ground among people who had vastly different objectives and methods. But again, this wasn't information she could share, and she doubted her interviewers would appreciate the parallels between managing Afghan tribal politics and corporate team dynamics. Jennifer made a note on her tablet, her expression suggesting she was recording Rebecca's responses with the clinical detachment of someone documenting a failed experiment. "What about technology? The military tends to be somewhat behind the curve when it comes to cutting-edge business software and systems." Rebecca almost smiled at this one. The military's technological capabilities were so far ahead of most corporate systems that it was like comparing a Formula One race car to a bicycle. She had worked with satellite communication systems, encrypted databases, and real-time intelligence platforms that made most corporate software look like something from the 1990s. "I'm very comfortable with technology," she said diplomatically. "I've worked with a variety of systems and I'm quick to learn new platforms." The interview continued for another 30 minutes, with each question revealing more about the interviewers. preconceptions than about Rebecca's qualifications. They asked about her ability to work in a fast-paced environment, as if military operations were conducted at a leisurely pace. They questioned her understanding of customer service, as if building relationships with local populations in war zones was somehow less challenging than managing corporate clients. Bradley asked about her leadership style, clearly expecting her to describe something authoritarian and inflexible. When she spoke about adaptive leadership and situational awareness, he nodded with the patronizing approval of someone who thought he was hearing a scripted response. Marcus wanted to know about her entrepreneurial mindset, apparently unaware that military officers are routinely expected to accomplish complex objectives with minimal resources and maximum efficiency. When Rebecca mentioned her experience with budget management and resource allocation, he made a note that suggested he was checking off a box rather than truly listening to her response. The subtle dismissal as the interview wound down, Rebecca could feel the energy in the room shifting toward its inevitable conclusion. The three interviewers exchanged glances that spoke of a decision already made, though they maintained the pretense of consideration. "Well, Miss Chen," Jennifer said, her tone taking on the artificial warmth of someone delivering disappointing news, "this has been very illuminating. Your military background is certainly unique, and we appreciate your service to our country." The phrase, "appreciate your service," had become a kind of conversational bookmark, something people said when they wanted to acknowledge military service without actually engaging with its implications. Rebecca had heard it thousands of times, usually from people who had no idea what they were appreciating. Bradley shifted in his chair, his expression taking on what he probably thought was a thoughtful look. "The challenge, as I see it, is that this position requires someone who can hit the ground running in a complex business environment. While your military experience is admirable, it's quite different from the corporate world." Marcus nodded in agreement, his fingers steepled in a gesture that suggested deep consideration. "We're looking for someone who can bring fresh ideas and innovative approaches to our government contracts division. Someone who understands the business side of defense contracting, not just the military side." Rebecca felt a familiar tightness in her chest, the same sensation she had experienced countless times when people dismissed her capabilities based on assumptions rather than evidence. She had spent years proving herself in environments where the stakes were life and death, where failure meant not just lost profits but lost lives. She had successfully negotiated with tribal leaders who had been fighting each other for generations, convincing them to work together for mutual benefit. She had managed budgets that funded operations across multiple countries, ensuring that every dollar was accounted for and every expenditure justified. She had led teams of specialists from different branches of the military, coordinating their efforts to achieve objectives that seemed impossible on paper, but none of this mattered in a conference room in Seattle, where success was measured in quarterly earnings and innovation was defined by the ability to find new ways to extract profit from government contracts. "I understand your concerns," Rebecca said, her voice remaining steady despite the frustration building inside her. "However, I believe my experience gives me a unique perspective on what government agencies actually need, rather than what contractors think they need." The comment was perhaps more direct than she had intended, and she could see the three interviewers stiffen slightly at the implied criticism. Jennifer's smile became even more artificial, while Bradley's expression suggested he was dealing with an unpleasant smell. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his tone taking on a slight edge. "Miss Chen, I think you may have a misconception about what we do here. We're not just contractors, we're strategic partners with the government, helping them achieve their objectives more efficiently and cost-effectively." Rebecca nodded politely, though she was thinking about the millions of dollars in unnecessary equipment and services that companies like Meridian routinely sold to the government, often at prices that were 3 or 4 times what the military could procure the same items for directly. "Of course," she said. "I'm sure you provide valuable services." The final verdict. The interview concluded with the standard promises to be in touch and the usual expressions of gratitude for her time. Rebecca shook hands with each of the three interviewers, noting the subtle but unmistakable relief in their expressions. They had conducted their due diligence, checked the box for veteran outreach, and could now move on to candidates who better fit their preconceived notions of what they needed. As she walked back through the maze of cubicles toward the lobby, Rebecca could feel the eyes of the remaining candidates upon her. They had probably been waiting for hours, and her relatively quick interview suggested either exceptional success or rapid failure. Their expressions suggested they had correctly guessed which one it was. In the lobby, she paused to collect her thoughts before stepping back into the Seattle afternoon. The rain had stopped, leaving the city washed clean and gleaming in the pale sunlight. She stood for a moment on the sidewalk outside Meridian Defense Solutions, watching the flow of pedestrians and traffic that constituted the rhythm of civilian life. Her phone buzzed with a text from her roommate asking how the interview had gone. Rebecca stared at the message for a long moment, trying to formulate a response that wouldn't sound as bitter as she felt. The transition from military to civilian life had been more challenging than she had anticipated, not because of any lack of capability on her part, but because of the vast gulf between what she had actually done and what people assumed she had done. She had applied for dozens of positions over the past 6 months, each one resulting in the same polite dismissal. Her military credentials were impressive on paper, but they seemed to create more barriers than opportunities in the corporate world. Employers wanted veterans because it looked good for their diversity metrics, but they didn't actually want the complications that came with hiring someone whose background couldn't be easily categorized. The call 2 hours later, Rebecca was sitting in her small apartment in Capitol Hill, still wearing her interview clothes but with her shoes kicked off and her hair released from its professional bun. She had just finished updating her job search spreadsheet, a depressing document that tracked applications, interviews, and rejections with the methodical precision of a military operation, when her phone rang. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, but the area code was local. She answered with her standard professional greeting, expecting either a sales call or perhaps a follow-up from another job application. Rebecca Chen? The voice was female, middle-aged, with the kind of authority that suggested someone accustomed to being obeyed. Yes, this is Rebecca. This is Margaret Stevens from Meridian Defense Solutions. I'm calling to inform you that we've decided to move forward with other candidates for the position you interviewed for today. Rebecca had been expecting this call, though she was somewhat surprised by how quickly it had come. Most companies took at least a few days to deliver their rejections, if they bothered to call at all. I see, she said. May I ask what factors led to that decision? There was a pause on the other end of the line, as if Margaret was considering whether to provide an honest answer or stick to the standard corporate talking points. Frankly, Miss Chen, we felt that your background, while impressive, wasn't quite the right fit for our corporate culture. This position requires someone who can bring a fresh perspective to our government contracts division, someone who understands the business side of defense contracting. Rebecca felt the familiar surge of frustration, but she kept her voice level. I understand. Thank you for letting me know. Of course. We'll keep your resume on file for future opportunities that might be a better match for your unique skill set. The phrase, unique skill set, was delivered with the kind of tone that suggested something mildly distasteful, like a medical condition that required special accommodations. After hanging up, Rebecca sat in her small living room, staring at the rejection letter she would never receive. The apartment was spartanly furnished, reflecting both her limited budget and her military-influenced preference for simplicity. The only decorations were a few framed photographs from her service and a small American flag that had been presented to her at her retirement ceremony. She thought about calling her mentor, Colonel Sarah Martinez, who had helped her navigate the transition from military to civilian life. But she was tired of being the veteran who couldn't make it in the corporate world, tired of needing guidance and support for challenges that should have been straightforward. Instead, she opened her laptop and began searching for new job opportunities. Though the prospect of repeating this process indefinitely felt increasingly daunting. She had served her country with distinction for 12 years, leading complex operations and managing resources that most corporate executives couldn't even comprehend. But somehow, none of that mattered in a conference room in Seattle. The unexpected response. What Rebecca didn't know was that her rejection call had been overheard by someone who had been quietly monitoring Meridian Defense Solutions for entirely different reasons. In a nondescript office building 3 blocks away, a woman in her 50s with silver hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to command was reviewing surveillance transcripts with growing displeasure. General Patricia Hawthorne, Deputy Chief of Staff for the Army, had been conducting a routine review of defense contractors when Rebecca's name had appeared in an intercept. The general had immediately recognized the name from classified reports that had crossed her desk years earlier, reports that detailed operations so sensitive that even their existence was compartmentalized. As she read through the transcript of Rebecca's interview, General Hawthorne's expression grew increasingly stern. The casual dismissal of a decorated intelligence officer, the condescending questions about her ability to adapt to corporate culture, and the final rejection based on her unique skill set, represented exactly the kind of institutional blindness that had been undermining military-civilian cooperation for decades. General Hawthorne reached for her secure phone and began making calls. The first was to her aide, instructing him to pull Rebecca Chen's complete service record. The second was to the Pentagon's Office of Strategic Communication, requesting a comprehensive review of Meridian Defense Solutions' current government contracts. The third call was to a number that would soon appear on the phone of Bradley Morrison, Meridian's head of strategic operations, though he wouldn't recognize it until it was too late. As Rebecca sat in her apartment, updating her job search spreadsheet and preparing for another round of applications and rejections, she had no idea that her dismissal from Meridian Defense Solutions was about to trigger a chain of events that would transform not just her own prospects, but the entire defense contracting industry's approach to hiring veterans, the phone call that would change. Everything was still 30 minutes away, but the wheels were already in motion. Set in motion by a 4-star general who had just learned that one of the Army's most decorated intelligence officers had been dismissed by a defense contractor as lacking the skills necessary to succeed in the corporate world. General Patricia Hawthorne sat in her Pentagon office, surrounded by the symbols of 3 decades of military service. The Distinguished Service Medal on her wall caught the afternoon light as she reviewed the file that had just been delivered by courier. Major Rebecca Chen's service record told a story that would have impressed even the most seasoned military professionals, yet somehow a defense contractor had dismissed her as unqualified for corporate life. The general's jaw tightened as she read through classified operation reports that painted a picture of extraordinary competence under impossible conditions. Operation Desert Shield had been Rebecca's first major assignment as a young lieutenant, where she had established communication networks with Kurdish tribal leaders in northern Iraq. The mission had required not just linguistic skills. Rebecca was fluent in Arabic, Kurdish, and Farsi, but an intuitive understanding of cultural dynamics that had allowed her to broker agreements between groups that had been at war for centuries. Her promotion to captain had come after a classified operation in Afghanistan where she had single-handedly prevented what intelligence analysts later determined would have been a catastrophic attack on a NATO supply convoy. Working with only a local interpreter and a handheld radio, she had identified and neutralized a network of insurgent spotters who had been tracking convoy movements for months. The file contained commendations from generals, intelligence officials, and foreign military leaders who had worked with Rebecca during her 12-year career. A British SAS colonel had written that she possessed the finest operational mind I have encountered in 2 decades of joint operations. A CIA station chief had described her as invaluable in establishing human intelligence networks in hostile territory. But what struck General Hawthorne most was a recommendation letter from General Marcus Thompson, former commander of Special Operations Command, who had written, "Major Chen represents the finest qualities of American military leadership. Her ability to adapt, innovate, and succeed in complex environments makes her an invaluable asset to any organization fortunate enough to secure her services." And yet, 3 corporate executives in Seattle had determined that this woman lacked the skills necessary to succeed in their business environment. General Hawthorne reached for her secure phone and dialed a number that connected directly to the office of the Secretary of Defense. "Sir, this is General Hawthorne. We need to discuss a matter of national security that involves the defense contracting community's treatment of our veterans." The corporate reckoning. Meanwhile, at Meridian Defense Solutions, Bradley Morrison was enjoying what he considered a productive afternoon. The veteran interviews were completed, and he felt confident that they had avoided the complications that came with hiring military personnel who might not understand corporate culture. He was reviewing proposals for their next government contract when his assistant knocked on his door. "Mr. Morrison, there's a call for you on line 1. She says she's General Hawthorne from the Pentagon." Bradley chuckled. "Probably another veteran trying to leverage military connections. Tell her I'm in meetings all afternoon." His assistant shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, I verified the number. It's definitely from the Pentagon," and she was very insistent. Bradley's smile faded slightly. Defense contractors lived and died by their relationships with Pentagon officials, and even prank calls from that building required careful handling. "Fine, put her through." The voice that came through his phone was crisp, authoritative, and unmistakably accustomed to being obeyed. "Mr. Morrison, this is General Patricia Hawthorne, Deputy Chief of Staff for the Army. I understand you recently interviewed Major Rebecca Chen for a position in your government contracts division." Bradley felt a cold sensation in his stomach. "Yes, General, we did interview Miss Chen. Impressive background, though not quite the right fit for our corporate environment." "I see. And what specifically about Major Chen's background made her unsuitable for corporate work?" The question was delivered with the kind of clinical precision that suggested the general was already well aware of the answer. Bradley found himself struggling to articulate the assumptions that had seemed so reasonable 3 hours earlier. "Well, General, it's not that she was unsuitable exactly. It's just that military experience, while admirable, doesn't necessarily translate to the business world. We need someone who can think creatively and work collaboratively in a fast-paced environment." The silence that followed was so complete that Bradley wondered if the call had been disconnected. When General Hawthorne finally spoke, her voice had dropped to a tone that made Bradley's blood pressure spike. Mr. Morrison, let me share some information with you about Major Chen's military experience. During Operation Enduring Freedom, she was responsible for coordinating intelligence operations across a region the size of Pennsylvania, managing assets from 6 different countries and preventing attacks that would have cost hundreds of American lives. Bradley opened his mouth to respond, but the general continued. Her collaborative work included building relationships with tribal leaders, government officials, and military commanders who had been fighting each other for decades. Her creative thinking included developing new approaches to human intelligence gathering that are still classified and still saving lives today. The general's voice took on an edge that could have cut steel. Her fast-paced environment was Afghanistan, Mr. Morrison, where the wrong decision didn't just cost money, it cost lives. And you determined that she wasn't qualified to help your company sell supplies to the government? Bradley found his voice, though it came out as more of a croak. General, I think there may have been some misunderstanding. The only misunderstanding, Mr. Morrison, is your company's inability to recognize talent when it walks through your door. Major Chen isn't just qualified for your position, she's overqualified. The real question is whether your company is qualified to employ someone of her caliber. The revelation General Hawthorne wasn't finished. She had spent the past hour reviewing not just Rebecca's file, but Meridian Defense Solutions' contract history. What she had found was a pattern of mediocrity hidden behind expensive marketing and political connections. Mr. Morrison, I'm looking at your company's performance on contract Delta 77 Alpha, the communications systems upgrade for forward operating bases. You were 6 months behind schedule and 40% over budget. Do you know who salvaged that project? Bradley's mouth went dry. Contract D-77A had been a nightmare that had nearly cost him his job. The technical requirements had been more complex than anticipated, and his team had struggled to understand the operational needs of the personnel who would actually use the systems. It was Major Chen, the general continued. She was still on active duty, stationed at Bagram Airfield, when your technical team arrived for their site survey. Your people were lost, Mr. Morrison. They had no idea how to design a communication system that would actually work in a combat environment. The general's voice carried the weight of someone who had access to information that could destroy careers. Major Chen spent 3 weeks working with your team, translating operational requirements into technical specifications, teaching your engineers about environmental challenges they had never considered, and helping them understand the difference between what looks good in a PowerPoint presentation and what actually keeps soldiers alive. Bradley remembered the project, though he had never known the details of how his team had suddenly found solutions to problems that had seemed insurmountable. The official reports had credited improved coordination with local military liaisons, but he had never investigated further. Your company received a commendation for that project, Mr. Morrison. You personally received a bonus based on its success. And today, you rejected the woman who made it possible because you thought she lacked the skills to succeed in your corporate environment. The wider investigation while General Hawthorne was delivering her pointed lesson to Bradley Morrison, other calls were being made throughout the Pentagon. The general had decided that Rebecca's case represented a systemic problem that required a systemic response. Colonel Martinez, Rebecca's former mentor, received a call that would change her afternoon plans. Sarah, this is Pat Hawthorne. I need you to pull together a team and review every defense contractor that has received significant government contracts in the past 2 years. I want to know their hiring practices, particularly regarding veterans. The investigation that followed would reveal a pattern of discrimination so pervasive that it threatened national security. Companies were routinely rejecting the most qualified applicants simply because their experience came from military rather than corporate backgrounds. The same veterans who had managed multi-million-dollar operations in combat zones were being dismissed as unqualified for entry-level corporate positions. Dr. James Patterson, a former Army logistics officer with a PhD in supply chain management, had been rejected by 3 different contractors despite having successfully managed supply operations for 50,000 troops across multiple theaters of operation. His rejection letters cited his lack of private sector experience. Captain Maria Rodriguez, who had served as a military intelligence analyst and held 2 master's degrees, had been told by a cybersecurity firm that her military background was too rigid for their innovative corporate culture. The firm had instead hired a recent college graduate whose primary qualification was an internship at a tech startup. The list went on, painting a picture of an industry that was systematically excluding the very people best qualified to understand its primary customer, the United States military. The corporate response back at Meridian Defense Solutions, Bradley Morrison's phone call with General Hawthorne had become the kind of conversation that executives have nightmares about. The general had methodically demolished every assumption underlying Rebecca's rejection, using specific examples from classified operations that Bradley couldn't access or verify. "General," Bradley said, his voice carefully controlled, "I want to assure you that we have the highest respect for military service. Perhaps there was a miscommunication during the interview process." "The miscommunication, Mr. Morrison, is your company's fundamental misunderstanding of what military service actually entails. You treat veterans like charity cases rather than the highly trained professionals they are." General Hawthorne had been building to this moment throughout the conversation. "I'm going to make this very simple for you. Major Chen's security clearance is still active, and she has experience with systems and operations that your company desperately needs to understand if you want to continue receiving government contracts." The implications hung in the air like a storm cloud. Defense contractors depended on their security clearances and their relationships with Pentagon officials. General Hawthorne was politely but unmistakably suggesting that both were at risk. "What would you like us to do, General?" "I want you to call Major Chen and offer her the position she interviewed for. I want you to offer her a salary commensurate with her actual qualifications, not what you think a veteran should be grateful to receive. And I want you to review your hiring practices to ensure that this kind of discrimination doesn't happen again." Bradley's mind raced through the implications. Offering Rebecca the position would require acknowledging that the entire interview panel had been wrong. It would also require explaining to the board why a Pentagon general had personally intervened in their hiring process. "Of course, General. I'll reach out to Miss Chen immediately." "Major Chen," the general corrected sharply. "She earned that rank through 12 years of distinguished service. Use it." The revelation to Rebecca was in her kitchen, preparing a simple dinner and trying not to think about her job search, when her phone rang again. The caller ID showed the same Meridian Defense Solutions number that had delivered her rejection 2 hours earlier. "This is Rebecca." "Major Chen, this is Bradley Morrison from Meridian Defense Solutions. I'm calling to discuss the position you interviewed for today." Rebecca set down her coffee cup, wondering if this was some kind of administrative follow-up to their earlier conversation. "Yes? I want to apologize for any miscommunication during our interview process. After further review, we've determined that your qualifications are exactly what we need for this position. We'd like to offer you the role of Senior Strategic Analyst, with a starting salary of $140,000 and full benefits." The number was nearly double what they had originally advertised for the position, and significantly more than Rebecca had been expecting based on her previous interviews with other companies. "I'm sorry, could you repeat that?" Bradley cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with the conversation. "We realize we may not have adequately conveyed our appreciation for your military background during the interview. Your experience with government operations and security protocols makes you uniquely qualified for this role." Rebecca sat down at her small kitchen table, trying to process what she was hearing. The same man who had questioned her ability to work in a collaborative environment was now praising her qualifications. "Mr. Morrison, I have to ask, what changed between this afternoon and now?" There was a long pause before Bradley answered. "We received some additional information about your service record that helped us better understand your qualifications." Rebecca's intelligence training kicked in, analyzing the conversation for subtext and implications. Someone had intervened on her behalf, someone with enough influence to completely reverse a hiring decision within hours. "I see. And this additional information came from whom?" Another pause. "I'm not at liberty to discuss the specifics, but I can assure you that we now have a complete picture of your capabilities." The broader impact. What Rebecca didn't know was that her case had become the catalyst for a much larger initiative. General Hawthorne had spent the evening briefing the Secretary of Defense on what she was calling the veterans' employment crisis, presenting evidence that defense contractors were systematically undervaluing military experience. The briefing had included specific examples of veterans being rejected for positions they were supremely qualified for, often by companies that were simultaneously struggling to deliver on their government contracts. The irony was stark: companies were failing to meet military requirements while rejecting the very people who best understood those requirements. Within 48 hours, the Pentagon had announced a new initiative requiring defense contractors to demonstrate veteran-friendly hiring practices as part of their contract eligibility. Companies would need to show not just that they hired veterans, but that they hired them for positions that actually utilized their military experience. The initiative would be named the Chen Protocol, though Rebecca wouldn't learn this until much later. Rebecca's decision. Rebecca sat in her apartment, staring at her phone and processing the surreal turn her day had taken. From rejection to job offer in the span of 2 hours suggested that powerful forces were at work behind the scenes. She thought about accepting the offer, taking the salary increase, and moving on with her life. It would solve her immediate financial problems and give her the professional stability she had been seeking, but something about the conversation with Bradley Morrison troubled her. His tone had been respectful but reluctant, suggesting that the offer was being made under duress rather than from genuine recognition of her qualifications. She called Colonel Martinez, her mentor, hoping for guidance. "Sarah, I was hoping you'd call. I can't discuss specifics, but I can tell you that your interview today has had some very significant consequences." "What kind of consequences?" "The kind that happen when people in very high places become aware of systemic problems. Your rejection wasn't just wrong, it was symptomatic of a much larger issue that needed addressing." Rebecca understood. Her case had become bigger than just her individual situation. It had become a symbol of how the civilian world often failed to understand or value military service. "What should I do about the job offer?" Colonel Martinez was quiet for a moment. "That's your decision, Rebecca. But I will say this, sometimes the best way to create change is from the inside. And right now, you have an opportunity to be inside an organization that desperately needs to understand what military service actually means." The new beginning. Rebecca accepted the position, but with conditions. She would take the job for 1 year, during which time she would develop and implement a veteran hiring and integration program for Meridian Defense Solutions. If the company was serious about changing its culture, they would need to do more than just hire her. They would need to transform their understanding of military service. Her first day at Meridian was unlike any first day she had ever experienced. Bradley Morrison personally introduced her to the team, describing her as a distinguished military intelligence officer whose expertise will be invaluable to our government contracts division. The same people who had ignored her in the waiting room now treated her with careful respect. Jennifer Morrison, who had conducted her dismissive interview, went out of her way to ensure that Rebecca had everything she needed, but Rebecca's real impact came in the months that followed. She reviewed Meridian's existing government contracts and identified millions of dollars in potential savings by streamlining operations and eliminating unnecessary bureaucracy. Her understanding of actual military needs allowed the company to propose solutions that were both more effective and less expensive than their previous approaches. More importantly, she began recruiting other veterans, not for token positions but for roles that genuinely utilized their military experience. The intelligence analyst who had been rejected by a cybersecurity firm became Meridian's new director of information security. The logistics officer with the PhD became their senior vice president of supply chain management. Within 6 months, Meridian's performance on government contracts had improved dramatically. Their completion times decreased by 30%, their cost overruns disappeared, and their client satisfaction scores reached levels the company had never achieved. The legacy. A year later, Rebecca received an invitation to speak at a Pentagon conference on veteran employment. General Hawthorne introduced her to an audience of defense contractors, military officials, and corporate executives. Major Chen's story illustrates both a problem and a solution, the general said. The problem is an employment system that systematically undervalues military experience. The solution is recognizing that veterans aren't just qualified workers, they're often the most qualified workers for positions that require leadership, adaptability, and performance under pressure. Rebecca's presentation focused on the business case for hiring veterans, using Meridian's transformation as a case study. She showed how companies could improve their performance by properly utilizing military experience rather than viewing it as a liability to be overcome. The audience included Bradley Morrison, who had become one of Rebecca's strongest supporters. His company's success with veteran hiring had become a model for the industry, and he frequently spoke at conferences about the value of military experience in corporate settings. After her presentation, a young veteran approached Rebecca. "Ma'am, I've been struggling to find employment since leaving the service. Employers keep telling me my military experience isn't relevant to civilian work." Rebecca smiled, remembering her own frustration from just a year earlier. "Your military experience isn't irrelevant," she said. "You just haven't found the right employer yet. But they're out there, and increasingly, they're learning to recognize talent when they see it." Epilogue. 2 years after her rejection from Meridian Defense Solutions, Rebecca had become one of the most sought-after consultants in the defense contracting industry. Companies across the country sought her expertise in developing veteran recruitment programs and improving their relationships with military clients. The Chen protocol had been adopted by dozens of companies and had resulted in the hiring of thousands of veterans in positions that genuinely utilized their military experience. The initiative had also led to improved performance on government contracts, saving taxpayers millions of dollars while providing better services to military personnel. Rebecca often thought about that afternoon in the Meridian waiting room, when She had been just another overlooked applicant hoping for a chance to prove herself. Her rejection had seemed like just another disappointment in a long series of disappointments, but it had actually been the beginning of something much larger. Sometimes, she reflected, the most important victories come not from being accepted, but from forcing the world to recognize what acceptance really means. Her story had become a reminder that hidden behind every quiet professional, every unassuming veteran, every person who doesn't fit conventional expectations, there might be capabilities that could transform not just their own life, but entire industries. The woman who had been dismissed as lacking corporate skills had ended up teaching the corporate world how to better serve its most important client, the United States military. And in doing so, she had honored not just her own service, but the service of every veteran who had ever been told that their experience didn't matter in the civilian world. In the end, Rebecca had found more than just a job. She had found her mission, ensuring that no other veteran would ever have to sit in a waiting room, hoping that someone would recognize the value of their service and give them a chance to prove what they were truly capable of achieving. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe and turn on the notification bell, so you don't miss any upload from us.